Okay, so you're here with us on the deep dive
Yeah.
because, well, you want to understand these, like, really complex issues.
Right, yeah.
But, like, without getting bogged down,
Yeah,
you know?
totally. Yeah, you want the core.
The core, you want it fast and you want it thorough.
Right. Exactly.
So that's what we try to do here.
That's the goal.
And today we are diving into the world according to Alberto Portugheis
Okay.
from his book, Dear Ahed.
Dear Ahed.
Yeah. So this is interesting because Portugheis is not like your typical, intellectual or writer or
Right.
he's actually a musician.
Yeah, a musician by trade.
Yeah. And so his voice in this book it's very direct.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of unpolished, but it's very like from the heart,
Absolutely. It's very raw
Yeah.
and passionate.
Yeah, he's very clearly passionate about these topics.
Yeah, and he even starts the book with like a little apology
Yeah.
for his English and for, any offense that he might cause. He's not trying to condemn entire groups of people or anything.
Right. He's really just trying to communicate what he sees as the truth.
Exactly. And I think that's what comes across so strongly.
Yeah.
Is this very unfiltered perspective,
Yeah.
He's not an academic sitting in an ivory tower.
Right.
This is a guy who's lived in and around these issues, and
Yeah.
he's sharing his observations.
And you can really get a sense of the scope of his thinking
Yeah.
just from the table of contents. I mean, he touches on everything
It's all over the place.
from like poetry and art
Uh-huh.
to the very hard realities of war.
Right.
And specifically, the tragedy of Palestine.
Yeah, he really runs the gamut.
So our mission, I guess, in this deep dive is to really extract
Yes.
the core of his argument about why conflict is so persistent.
Right, because he does some interesting things.
He connects some dots in some very unexpected ways.
Yeah, and it's all based on his personal encounters. So it's not just theory. It's like, this is what I've seen,
Right.
and this is what I think it means.
And that leads to some, potentially surprising conclusions.
For sure. Yeah. Get ready for some hot takes.
Definitely.
So, if we zoom out a little bit,
Yeah.
I think the big argument that emerges from the book
Uh-huh.
is that the main thing driving conflict,
Yeah.
it's not ideology or ethnic tension.
Right.
I mean, those things play a role.
They're there.
But for him, it's really all about
Yeah.
the business of weapons,
The weapons business.
manufacturing and trading weapons.
Yeah, about profit.
Exact.
Right. And he's very blunt about it.
Oh, yeah.
There's a quote where he says,
Pretty good quotes.
I know, and I'm going to quote him directly here.
Hit us with it.
He says, armed conflicts should be promoted, must be promoted.
All caps must be.
Otherwise, the industry collapses.
Right. So he's saying the entire system
Yeah,
depends on war.
On conflict to survive financially.
To function, yeah.
So then we have to ask, right?
Yeah.
What are the implications of that?
If that's even partly true, it's huge.
Right. And he throws out another,
He's got stats.
a really startling statistic. He claims that just 8%
8%.
of the money spent globally on weapons each year could solve world hunger,
Like, end it?
homelessness, preventable diseases.
That's wild.
I know.
But then he says there are these powers.
Right. These shadowy figures.
He doesn't get too specific,
Right.
but he says they're actively preventing
Yeah.
that kind of shift.
They want to keep things as they are.
Yeah, because they're profiting from it.
And he does get a little more specific when he talks about,
He names some names.
well, he talks about politicians and diplomats.
Okay.
And he suggests that they're often operating as
Like what?
arms dealers,
Oh,
basically,
wow.
with their own personal financial benefits tied to these arms negotiations.
So they're not just representing their countries?
Not exactly, no.
They're looking out for number one?
That's his argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he even brings up,
Real people.
yeah, some pretty big names.
Like who?
Margaret Thatcher, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush,
Wow.
as people who he believes were significantly involved
Straight.
in the arms trade, yeah, or profited from.
That's a serious accusation.
It is. It's a very bold claim.
It
And
makes you wonder what's going on.
yeah, what would drive someone to that conclusion?
Right.
What evidence does he have?
Yeah.
Well, we'll get into that, but it definitely makes you think.
For sure.
So then he goes on to talk about diplomacy.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because he suggests that sometimes
Sometimes.
dialogue and negotiation,
Which are supposed to be good things, right?
right, they're supposed to prevent conflict.
To prevent war.
He's saying sometimes they're actually about setting the stage for conflict.
Oh, so it's all a show.
Well, he uses the example of the Falklands War
Okay.
and the invasion of Iraq as cases where he believes
But the talks were
the lead-up discussions were actually
part of the plan. Yeah.
enabling the violence,
So it's almost like pre-negotiated.
right? Preordained in a way.
That's disturbing.
It is.
If true.
And then he gets into this whole idea of the U.S. maintaining
Full spectrum dominance.
full spectrum dominance. Yeah.
Yeah.
And for those of you who might not know,
Not everyone's a military strategist.
right, full spectrum dominance basically means military superiority.
Across the board.
Yeah, land, air, sea, space,
Pretty
cyber.
safe thing.
And Portugheis argues that this doctrine,
Okay.
from his perspective,
Yeah.
requires a world in near constant low-level conflict.
Oh, so we have to have some war
That's what he's saying.
to maintain dominance.
And he specifically talks about keeping third world countries economically dependent,
Okay. I see.
which then creates a demand for weaponry.
Right. We need weapons to fight these wars
Exactly.
that we're having to maintain dominance.
And then he brings up the 700 or so
700.
U.S. military bases around the world.
That's a lot.
It is.
So they're everywhere.
And he argues that these bases aren't just about
Strategy.
strategic positioning, but they're also a built-in justification
Okay.
for ongoing military planning
I see.
and huge military spending.
So if you build it.
You will use it.
Okay.
That's the idea.
Oh, okay.
And then he gets really cynical.
Uh-oh.
He even suggests that weapon
The
manufacturers
companies making the weapons?
could be involved in creating their own markets.
What does that even mean?
He's talking about militias,
Okay.
revolutionary armies,
Yeah.
terrorists, criminals,
Customers.
as potential customers.
So they're creating the demand.
That's his argument.
That is cynical.
It's a self-feeding cycle of violence,
Wow.
all fueled by profit.
And he talks about these arms fairs
Oh, yeah.
where companies actually compete by showing off how deadly their weapons are.
It's like a trade show for death.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. So he paints a pretty bleak picture
Definitely.
of a global industry ruthlessly focused on profit,
Yeah.
even if it means promoting violence and conflict.
Okay, so that's the weapons industry.
Right.
But he also talks about
Religion and politics.
religion and politics, yeah.
And how they're all intertwined.
Right.
So he argues that theistic religions,
Okay.
they didn't start as purely spiritual movements.
They weren't just about faith.
No, he says they were political movements.
With a goal.
A goal of acquiring land, power, and wealth.
So it was about control
Yeah.
from the beginning.
And he says that throughout history, wars have often been waged against people of other religions
Other religion.
as a way to consolidate power and expand influence,
So religion as a tool?
as a tool for political gain.
Okay.
And he gives examples like the conflicts between
Catholics and Protestants.
Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, yeah,
Right.
and the Spanish Civil War,
Okay.
where he points out Catholics were killing Catholics.
So it wasn't really about faith then.
Right, it was about power.
Yeah.
And then he shares this anecdote,
The story.
yeah, about a priest in Italy
Okay.
who allegedly confided in him
That
and
even the Pope,
doesn't truly believe.
in religious doctrine,
Right, he's basically saying it's all
a game
a battle for power,
and money.
a business. So he sees this close relationship
Between religion and politics.
as a recurring driver of conflict.
Through history.
And then he makes the argument that
Separation of church and state.
is often more of an ideal.
Than reality.
Yeah, and he uses the example of
The Archbishop of Canterbury.
in England,
Right?
where the church still has a role.
In the selection process.
And the government, yeah,
So they're not really separate.
not entirely.
No. Okay.
And he also points out how
Religious teachings themselves.
can contribute to conflict.
How so?
Well, particularly the belief that
One religion's right.
and all others are wrong.
Yeah, that's not going to lead to peace.
Not usually. No, it breeds division and hostility.
Right.
So he's really focused on these mechanisms.
That divide us.
And then he goes on to talk about
How we're conditioned.
to accept war as normal military training,
Okay.
which he argues dehumanizes people.
Dehumanizes.
Yeah, it teaches them to kill
But it's
without
doing more.
moral consideration.
Right.
And he says this dehumanization goes beyond the military.
It's all around us.
It's in our education system.
Okay.
The media we consume,
Entertainment.
TV, movies, video games,
All of it. He thinks it all contributes to brainwashing us
into accepting war.
as not only normal, but even heroic.
Wow.
He points out how history is often taught
From a patriotic perspective,
glorifying military heroes.
without really questioning.
The wars themselves.
Right.
And then he has this really stark quote
Attributed.
to Hitler.
Oh, boy.
How lucky for rulers that people do not think.
Yeah, that's scary.
And it highlights his belief that
People are easily manipulated.
yeah, we can be led to accept these narratives without really thinking critically.
And then he goes after the UN.
The UN.
He's not a fan.
He's very critical. He describes it as a club of nations.
That's more about promoting
the weapons business
than working towards peace.
So they're not really peacekeepers.
He doesn't. So he says their peacekeeping efforts are often just a facade.
A show.
And that the UN actually contributes to the continuation of conflict.
Because it's profitable.
For its member states, yeah.
And he talks about a claim in the book that there was an increase
in weapons factories
during a period of supposed peace.
When the UN was supposedly promoting peace.
So they're not doing what they say they're doing.
That's his argument.
Okay.
And he's also very skeptical.
About the UN's humanitarian goals.
Yeah, he suggests that organizations like
the High Commission for Human Rights
and refugees,
they might actually be serving more than humanitarian ones.
And then he accuses the UN of
creating divisions.
Yeah, geographical, ethnic, religious.
They lead to conflict.
So they're creating the problems they claim to be solving.
It's a self-perpetuating system.
And then he turns his attention to
the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, which is obviously incredibly complex.
One of the most complex.
And he argues that this conflict
is not just about
Israelis and Palestinians.
There are outside forces.
He said it's perpetuated by external powers.
Who benefit from it?
From the tension.
Yeah.
Who are these powers?
He specifically points to the U.S., suggesting that it wants a Middle Eastern conflict.
Why would they want that?
To maintain control and influence in the region.
So it's about power.
Ultimately, yeah.
And he also suggests that some leaders
on both sides,
Israeli and Palestinian,
might have a personal stake
in the conflict continuing.
Yeah, for financial or political gain.
So they don't want peace either.
And he mentions Yasser Arafat as an example of someone who he claims
became wealthy
as a result of the conflict.
Wow.
And his perspective on international law is also interesting.
What does he say?
Well, he suggests that Israel is allowed to
operate outside the law.
In some ways, more than other nations.
So they get a pass. But then he also argues that in other ways,
Israel is actually controlled
by international law.
So it's both.
It's complicated.
And
it highlights the kind of paradoxical nature.
The global power dynamics.
And then he gets into the very sensitive topic
of the Holocaust.
He's not denying the Holocaust.
Okay.
But he suggests that the way it's presented sometimes
can be manipulated
to fuel hatred and anti-Judaism.
To being used.
To hinder peace.
Wow.
And then he points to the existence of
Jewish-Muslim peace groups.
And villages where they live together peacefully.
As proof that
coexistence is possible.
That it's not inevitable.
That conflict is not inevitable.
Right.
And then he makes this really startling claim.
What's that?
That the ingredients for bombs
for Palestinian militants
are sometimes supplied by Israelis. Yeah, it's the business mentality.
Even when it comes to
violence and conflict.
Yeah, so he's saying
money trumps ideology.
That's pretty bleak.
It is. But despite all of this,
he does offer a path to peace.
He does.
What is it?
He says we have to dismantle
the weapons industry
completely. He says, and I'm quoting again, there will never be peace, justice, and human rights unless we close all the manufacturing plants of guns, tanks.
So that's step one.
And he also emphasizes the importance of education.
Education.
We need to teach people
to understand conflict,
to see through the propaganda
and the manipulation,
to reject the brainwashing that promotes violence.
So it's about critical thinking.
He calls for a radical change of education,
where peace is the norm.
And he advocates for something he calls
peace journalism.
Yeah, a type of news reporting that prioritizes understanding instead of sensationalizing violence.
So changing the narrative.
And finally, he stresses the importance of
global unity, a sense of interconnectedness.
Yeah, he believes that's essential for lasting peace.
So it's a pretty tall order.
It is.
But he thinks it's possible.
If we dare to know
the truth.
So to sum up,
Portugheis' argument
is that the weapons industry
is the driving force behind conflict.
It's linked to politics and religion.
And sustained by manipulation and brainwashing.
So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of the world, Portugheis' book offers a very challenging
and thought-provoking
on the forces driving conflict.
And it leads to a final question.
A question for you.
If profit from weapons is the main cause of war,
what can we do about it?
What actions can we take?
Individually and collectively.
To shift this paradigm.
To create a more peaceful world.
Think about that.
And we encourage you to explore Portugheis's book further.
Or to research these topics.
And learn more.
Because understanding is the first step
Towards change.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.